Hi, and welcome to the Work Smarter, Not Harder Rewind podcast. I'm Brittany Alligood.
And I'm Scott Holcomb.
And we're part of the program accountability team in the data research and accountability department here at Wake County Public Schools. And today we're taking a break from our usual format with an exciting crossover episode that we have between us and our sibling DRA podcast, Data Lit. So, Scott, do you want to tell them about what's in store for this episode?
Yes, I had the opportunity to join Spencer Ziegler from DataLit to interview Elk Estrella from our data strategy and analytics team, as well as Kendra Allen and Susan Bach from Library Media Services to discuss their collaborative research project on our school libraries.
So thank you for joining us for this crossover special episode, and we hope you enjoy.
Thanks. I'm Scott Holcomb.
I'm Spencer Ziegler, and welcome to a special crossover episode of DataLit and Work Smarter, Not Harder. So, Scott, last time we were both on an episode together, we were competing in a trivia contest.
I think Brittany and I won, if I remember correctly.
That's not how I recall it, but sure. But now it's nice. Now we're on the same side this time, so it's a little bit more, collaborative.
Yes. So before we dive into the interview, Spencer, you were a classroom teacher for a while, right?
Yep. Middle and high school.
So you may be familiar with this. You finished teaching a lesson. The students were engaged, participating, lots of hand raising. Everything seemed to be on that day. It's very tempting to kind of lean back as the teacher, I'd imagine, and just say, "Oh, my gut feeling says everybody got it. We're good. Let's just plug along here." But how did you actually know if your students learned what you intended them to learn? How did you move past that feeling into evidence?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think too often I probably just relied on my gut and just the bundle of anxiety that's constantly there. But over time, I think I learned to start to kind of gauge and get some information from students in terms of what worked and what didn't. But then over time, I think that pushed me to think of like, okay, how I'm getting that information, is it representative to all my students? So little by little, not as much as I would have liked, I think I began to kind of think of things in terms of research methods, kind of small R research methods, and a way to gauge what's working and what's not working. And that's essentially what we're going to discuss today. How do you measure what's going well and what could improve in a systematic manner? And we're going to do so by looking at some really captivating ongoing research on our school libraries. So we're thrilled today to chat with Kendra Allen and Susan Bach from Library Media Services, as well as Elk Estrella from Data Research and Accountability. Kendra, Susan, Elk, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yep, excited to be here today.
So what are some of the reports and resources you all have collaborated on?
So with Elk's assistance, we've been able to take a look at different ways of looking at our library data. Our system has a number of reports in it already that school librarians can use on the regular, and it also has limitations. And in partnering with Data Research and Accountability, we've been able to bring in other data inputs so that we can look at student characteristics and school characteristics, and then be able to have school-specific reports, to be able to look at district-wide reporting, and just have a broader analysis that we can put into infographics, that we can put into various visual representations, as well as written briefs, and also, like I said, school-specific reports that really drill down the data for our librarians as to who and what is going on in their library at their particular site.
So how did this collaboration research originate? Because y'all different departments, it's not quite, I'm going to try to get some literary references in, considering that it's not quite, Montagues and Capulets, but, how did you guys begin collaborating, and where did this research start?
So if Elk is Romeo and I'm Juliet, we had a meeting of the minds.
Nice.
In the course of things. And Elk and I were just discussing opportunities. We found ourselves in different professional learning together by happenstance, and one conversation led to another, and recognizing that ELK has aptitudes and capabilities that we don't have. And my office is very interested in data and how we can take a look at that. We've often tried to do our homegrown efforts that take a lot of Googling for Excel formulas and various other ways to try to analyze our data and get more out of it than what we've been able to get so far. And having ELK go, well, I could take a look at it this way, and I have this ability and I have access to this, and have you thought about that? And so we started out with just a general conversation about libraries and what we want to understand about our libraries in terms of best practice and how they can be most successful and what actually works. What ELK, I think you can speak to this too, have discovered is that there's a lack of high quality research around school libraries in terms of school library effectiveness and what those real practices are. So we operate in a space of not having enough research out there to really take a look at and resort to. So it became a possibility for us to do our own.
Yeah, I think to build on that, I'm always intrigued by finding ways to repurpose data or to use data in ways that haven't been considered before. I think one thing that was really intriguing to me about this work was the kind of data that librarians can see about students and checkouts. And it's very limited. They can see, for example, over a certain time, like a month or a week, how many books a student checked out. Okay, but that kind of data, it's not easily connected or linkable to the other kinds of administrative data sources that folks in DRA work with. So as Kendra was saying, you can't see what the demographic characteristics are of a student or what their foundational literacy skills might be. And I think from the kind of work we do in DRA, we want to have a better, richer understanding of student outcomes or student, behaviors along these different dimensions. So that's things like gender, race, ethnicity, measures of skills like literacy skills. And so one of the things I realized about this project initially was the data aren't even in a form we can use programmatically. Like we can't link it to other data sources. And so I think that was an exciting and easy kind of win. It's like, I don't know if it was easy. It took a lot of effort converting these, figuring out what the process was to convert these PDFs into Excel files, that takes a lot of time. But once we got there, we could link students based on ID to all of their other characteristics. And I think that was really powerful for you all in Library Media Service to see, because you hadn't seen that. As far as I know, you hadn't been able to do that kind of descriptive analysis before, just telling the story of who's checking out books at what rate, what frequency, in which schools, And so that was just one part of the project, is just opening up the data and seeing what more we could learn from it. Yeah.
Sounds like there are a lot of pieces there, and that's something that maybe there's data, but it's kind of tricky to measure because you have to kind of build it all and make it into that cohesive piece. So how did you design your research to directly answer your main questions?
So we struggled initially with this because there are a number of ways to look at data, and there are things in library practice that are more easily quantifiable and others that are less easily quantifiable. And that has always been part of our departmental struggle, is how to paint an accurate picture. And circulation data is one of those baseline data points that we landed on, partly because it's familiar to not only our librarians, but it's familiar to the community of administrators, to teachers, to parents in the larger community at large, that the number of books kids check out, that practice of what we call circulation, that checking in and checking out of materials is, and what those numbers look like, is a very sort of standard measure that has understanding across audiences. And so that gave us a very sort of simple place of measurement from which to start. And in that recognition, we always, have the caveat that success is not fully on the shoulders of circulation numbers, that is not in totality a measurement that speaks the entire story. And it's a really solid starting place. And we also have that data, while imperfect in its PDF outputs at the time that we started, was also something that we already had access to and could pull with little or no challenge. And so, especially with our district account levels, that we could pull that data and then take it to ELK for assistance.
Yeah. So I think to also add to that, I mean, it's a pretty intuitive measure of engagement with the library or using the library. So if we can see the count of books, that's the thing. It's such a simple measure, just the number of books a student checked out over a given time span. You can derive two things from that. One is whether they ever checked out a book over that time span. Okay. And then what Kendra is saying is the number of books. And what's also nice is it's because of how books get checked out, in this, century, we can track that, and so it's a measure that's available on anyone who's using the library. And by implication, anyone who's not using the library, like a student who could use a library but is not, we can see that too. And I think that's also an important measure, is whether there's students who are not checking out books. That's something we want to see too. Yeah.
From a design standpoint, like what we realized that context mattered as well. Whether or not students were checking things out didn't happen in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. So we also had to gather data about what type of schedule did the library run on, and what were the different kind of procedures that they had for how kids brought books in and out, and whether or not they could get more books if they hadn't returned the first ones they'd gotten, and all of those different sorts of things. So there was additional information that we decided to gather to be able to contextualize what those checkout numbers were, kind of the environment that they were happening in.
Yeah. So I'd love to expound upon that. I think there's at least like two parts of this endeavor, this enterprise. One is being able to build a data set that links, student library engagement with other student characteristics. That hadn't been done before. And so then we can query that data set and paint a story of which student groups are checking out books at which rates. So then the other component of this too is, as Susan's mentioning, is having a better understanding of what library policies and practices look like across like the 120 elementary schools. Because the thing to note is these all operate independently of one another, as I understand it. They can all, librarians in the schools that they work in, decide on what the policies are. And so one of the policies, for example, there's two that I think really stick out that we mention or flag in this report, is whether a school or a library permits unlimited checkouts. Like, can a student just check out as many books as they want? Okay. Or does the library impose a ceiling, like a maximum on the number of books a student can have out at any given time? Another policy that's relevant is, does the library allow students to check out books when they have overdue books? And so there's a lot of, I think there's variation across libraries and what policies they have. And there's variation by school characteristics too, which we can talk about as well. So school characteristics being like Title I or restart status.
Yeah, I appreciate what I'm hearing in terms of just this big research project between two different departments, thinking of all these schools. But what's kind of interesting is that I feel like this all applies down to, in terms of what might be a research question that just one individual teacher might have at a school and how to do it. Thinking with, okay, what do I want to know? What is that thing that my gut may or may not be telling me? And instead of just relying on that gut, I'm thinking, how might I confirm this? So thinking starting with like what data is available, like y'all talking about, okay, we have circulation data, and thinking about how do I clean it up or store it in a way that's going to allow me to make certain observations. And that might be something that you can do, or it might be someone that can help you out. Like Kendra and Susan, you go into ELK and saying like, we might be able to do a lot of work with our Excel skills, but here's someone with his programming skills that can make this much more efficient. And then, Susan, I like your point of just what contextual data do I need to put alongside this so that I'm not just relying on one data source? So that all I think is fascinating with just your work and what it tells us about libraries, but also I think it can be something that can be applied at the local level for schools.
And we often discuss the idea of best practices that in our space, and I would push it farther into just education in general, K-12 education, that there are a number of things that we purport as best practice. And with the broader discussion of evidence-based best practices, we, on the library side, operate with, we believe, these policies to be best practice, or they have sat in almost a lore space that the general consensus in the profession is that these are best practices. And yet we, in comparison, don't have or haven't had that evidence that then turns those into evidence-based best practices. They've been more or less hypothetical best practice based on what everyone believes to be a
kind of values-based.
Yeah, it's more of a values-based best practice as opposed to an evidence-based best practice scenario. And so part of what this has allowed us to do is have a sense of interrogating those value-based best practices and asking the tough question of, is it aligned to an evidence-based practice? Like, does the evidence play out that this is, in fact, the best thing for our kids, even though perhaps our gut has been telling us all these years that it is?
Yeah, so there were a lot of adjustments you all had to make with things that you're either finding out for the first time, or maybe some of it you were confirming with what you already knew about how the school libraries operated. But what other adjustments did you make once you started this collaboration?
I think one of the things that we had to do was also, even with our policy survey that we issued in the middle of all of our work as we were going along and wanting to gather that context of all the school policies, was that even something as simple as the schedule the library was on had to be defined better. We often think of terms like flexible schedules and fixed schedules as to difference at the elementary level of whether or not your classes are on a specials schedule where you expect to see the same second grade class on the same day of the week. But what we're finding is that our schools on their daily schedules often employ far more creative and differing schedules. And so we had to come up with a term of alternative schedule that we created simply because we needed a third option that encompassed these other differing daily schedules that some schools have designed. And that could mean that a librarian sees the same class for a number of days in a row, and then they don't see them again for several weeks in a row. And there are varying class schedules that principals have designed more so late in more recent years, it feels like, than others where they've kind of been more creative. And how did we anticipate capturing that? And I think one of the things that ELK also helped us do in doing that survey was breaking down our questions by grade level as well, recognizing that for instance, in the schedule conversation, the schedule option may not be the same for first grade as it is for fifth grade. They might run a particular schedule option in kindergarten, first and second, and then do a different schedule option in third, fourth, and fifth. And by dropping that into a granularity of asking the question by grade level, we were able to more accurately get the data, whereas it's not something we had considered before, because when we've done our end of year reports just out of our office in the past, I don't think we asked that question in that way. So being able to look and reframe that question in a way that we got more accurate data back from the librarians we surveyed about just something as simple as schedule was something that we had to adjust as we started to look at the survey questions, what was really going on in our schools and how someone could feel confident in their response to our survey, that it accurately portrayed what is going on for them.
Yeah, I think accuracy that's an important word here. When we were developing the survey, I think we really had to be thoughtful about constructing like a typology for these things we wanted to measure. What are all the different ways students could visit the library, or what are all of the different ways that students could browse the library? I think from a researcher lens, it feels like, I think researchers, and maybe I'm guilty of it too, is like feeling like we have like all of the answers, but because we have like the data, we can see the data. But like in this case, Susan and Kendra were the subject matter experts here. And so I would pepper them with questions. And when I didn't understand something like library, like what could a library visit schedule look like? So you all being able to explain what the different ones are was super helpful, because then I could translate that into a survey item, and the results would be helpful to you.
Yeah, I like that point of investing time on the front end to make sure that you're asking questions in a way that's going to elicit the information that you need, and also get some of that context, like grade levels, or whatever the demographic thing there. And also to think about, going back to the Destiny conversation, that's going to give you an output of data that you can analyze simply. So instead of just like kind of quickly putting together the survey and sending out to everyone and then realizing like, oh no, I need to do a lot of work on the back end to clean it up, or to ask another survey to get this kind of stuff, taking some time and maybe just testing out first with like a couple, whoever you're trying to research, to see if it's going to give you the information and the data in a way that's going to be useful.
Well, and I think we did do that. We pulled in a small group of librarians before we sent the survey out to everybody. And we're just like, okay, these are the questions that we're thinking of asking. Would you know how to answer this question? Or would you be like, oh, but, right, and feel like you need to answer it and then give a big old explanation as to why? Because a lot of the questions that we've asked them on surveys that our department had created allowed for that, because we have such a close relationship with the people that we support in schools. Like we know that they often want to clarify and explain and all of those sorts of things. And so they were really helpful in pointing out ways that like, oh, well, I would be confused by you asking the question that way. Like because I would want to say this. And so we could build that into what we were doing as well. So that was really helpful.
And I think that's good practice from a researcher, or from like a scientific or research perspective, is like, you want to pilot a survey or get feedback on it before you roll it out to everyone who's supposed to take it. And so I'm really glad we did that. That's a major adjustment. There were some pretty big adjustments we made, even after hearing from, I don't know, like the 5, 7, or 10 librarians that you all were able to speak to and have them read over the survey and get feedback on it. Yeah. So thanks for doing that.
Yeah. And kudos to you all for asking that at that grade level, that granular level, because you're really, as the researcher side of things, I know that's adding a lot more messiness to the data set you're going to get on the back end of that survey, from going from that one column to now, if it's K through 5, I'm going to have 6 columns on this, and it's going to be a lot more for me to go through, but it's worth it to get that nuance and to discover those valuable insights from your schools.
Yeah. Thanks for raising that, because I think I'd love getting granular data, but especially when it makes sense too, because, kindergartners will probably be exposed to, a different set of library policies and practices than 5th graders because of their age and development, developmental stage. So I'm all about getting more granular data. And so for this project in particular, for this survey, being able to see policies by grade level within a school, I think super, super useful. Yeah.
Okay, so at this point, we've talked a bit about how you were framing questions to collect some data so that it would be actionable and useful for you. So what have you learned so far from that data?
So we've learned things from 2 kinds of data sources. One is the survey of library policies that we administered in fall 2024 and again in fall 2025. And we've learned things too from this like data set we've built that links student library engagement. So like number of circulations, number of checkouts, to these other student characteristics. So those are I just wanted to set the stage as like, those are the kind of 2 sources of data that we've been learning things from.
So I think it's been really helpful for librarians to be able to look at this data and learn things from it too. And then also, like you said, there's 2 sets of data. There's also 2 ways we're using it, right? We're using it as a department, like for ourselves, to think about what can we do differently to better support people with these efforts, but then also sharing with schools so that they can think about it again on that more granular level rather than looking district wide. Like, what is this data look like specifically for my school and or for a grade or for a class at my school, and what can I do to be able to kind of impact that? So I think one of the things that we saw when we were looking at it district wide, and I don't know if you want to go into this a little bit more, Elk, was that discrepancy between the types of policies that schools would have as it related to like checkouts and what happens when students have overdue books and those sorts of things. And that was something that we maybe might have had a gut feeling about, but we didn't know for sure. And so that was an interesting thing that came out of the initial data when we were looking at the survey.
Yeah. So there are 2 school characteristics we kind of zeroed in on: restart status and Title I. And so when we look at library policies along these 2 dimensions, we notice a couple of things. One would be when it comes to like permitting students to check out like an unlimited number of books, that tends to be a policy in non-Title I and non-restart schools. So there's more flexibility, I guess, in whether students can check out an unlimited number of books or the number of books they can check out even. And also whether or not they can check out books when they have books overdue. Like that tends to be more common in non-Title I and non-restart schools. As Susan said, we didn't have data to show that, but this survey did help us, see that was the case.
And as a result, we were able to then present that data to the librarians collectively and have them observe it, which has power in and of itself, as opposed to us telling them something, being able to show them the charts and the graphs and then just having them look at it and sit with it and see the numbers and the prevalence of the results and what story might that tell, and allow them to come to space of their own thinking and their own observation of that, as opposed to our trying to persuade them in a certain way or push our ethos and philosophy of practice on them, being able to allow them to see things that were in effect factual, as opposed to something that we might believe from our lens as professionals, be able to allow them to come to their own conclusions.
Yeah, moving from just my emotional gut response, which may or may not be accurate and is certainly personal. Whereas when you approach it with these kind of research methods, you're giving them kind of some data that they can think of in a little bit more of a objective way.
Yes. What we just discussed was things that we learned from the survey. I think there are at least 2 things we learned from just this data set that linked student library engagement to student characteristics. One of the things we saw was boys, I think at every grade level, just check out fewer books than girls do in that grade level. I don't know why, but it's something that we saw. I think it's potentially something that we had all thought, but we saw it there. Then the other thing we saw was we were able to link students to their beginning of year measures of foundational literacy skills, like the DIBELS, the dynamic indicators of basic early literacy skills. And so when we look at the composite scores get broken down into like 4 categories. Like it's well below benchmark, at benchmark, and above benchmark. Okay. And so that's indicating to the teacher, at what level the students' literacy skills are at the beginning of year. And what we saw was the students who are at well below benchmark, they were less likely to check out books than students at higher like literacy levels. And I think also they checked out fewer books. So I think that's kind of interesting to note, because I would wonder, perhaps, if students are low on their foundational literacy skills, one thing to consider would be, well, maybe they need access to more books or they need to have more books available to them. And so, hey, the school library would be a great resource.
Yeah, and the librarians themselves, because I think it's sometimes tricky when a kid's reading below grade level, then if they only get books that are subject matters that are for much younger kids, that sometimes can create this vicious cycle in terms of reading. But librarians, being the superstars that they are, they can find the right book, regardless of a kid's reading level, for that kid that's going to hopefully create a virtuous cycle.
I can really see how this data was useful for all the librarians themselves. That introspection that it kind of forces when you get a policy survey about your policies in your library, you're going to start thinking about, why am I doing these things with my library? And I would imagine most of them have some autonomy there with some things, not the school schedule, of course. But so now we're going to hear from Jenna Hall, one of our librarians over at Douglas Elementary, about how this research study benefited her students.
So, I met with the library media services team because they met with all the librarians and talked to us about the data and the things that were being run. And I found it interesting that I felt like our school had pretty low average circulation numbers, like per student, and that I had a significant number of students that actually had zero. And I was like, that seems really strange because the students enjoy being here in the library and I feel like they're checking out books. And so I went and ran the report that they showed me how to do that polled individual students who had like low numbers. And I found some very interesting results when I talked to students because I took those students and I talked to them one-on-one when they were here in class. And so one of my students actually told me that the reason he hadn't checked out books all year, and I think this was in like February at this point, was because he never had a book to return. But he had never checked out a book. So he didn't have a book to return because he had never checked one out. And that's something that I never would have taken the time to talk to him about or even realize if we hadn't used that data and I hadn't ran that report.
All right. So at this point, y'all have been collaborating for like around a year?
I think maybe like a
year and a half.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So what have you learned across that year and a half? What have you learned from this process?
One thing I've learned is how important it is for someone like me as a researcher to operate with like deference to my colleagues in these other offices who really are the subject matter experts. In this case, on like libraries and student library engagement, I can do the research stuff like programming a survey, working with the data, but with my colleagues in other departments, they're the folks who can start us off figuring out what the questions are, what the challenges are, and we'll work together to refine the research questions to figure out which ones even we can answer with the data that we have, whether we need to collect any other data like administering a survey. And so I think one of the takeaways for me was just how much knowledge you all have, being the folks who work with schools, with librarians directly. And I'm here to help you translate that into good research.
I think it's been really encouraging to see how librarians have responded to having this data, right? And DRA has been amazing with creating multiple ways for them to kind of access information about this, right? We have the research brief that we created that has the information from the survey that we gathered. ELK has created school-specific reports for each of the librarians so that they're able to kind of dig into their data that we're pulling from Destiny and combining with all of these other data sets to be able to really analyze it more deeply. And then we also have the data dashboard that they're able to engage with so that they can kind of look and compare not just like what's happening at their school, but other schools as well. And so having the opportunity for them to really engage so deeply with that has been really great. And they've been really excited to have that information, to be able to ask questions, to be able to use it to drive conversations that they have at their school, with their administration, with their teachers, with their media technology advisory committee. It's just really opened up a lot of opportunities for them to think deeply about which kids might be missing out on the services that they're able to provide, and for them to take actionable steps to be able to do something about that, right? So it's been fantastic.
I would also say that it's been helpful for us to have both school-specific conversations in terms of our support from our office with coaching and other ways that we're trying to support for the success of a program, depending on what questions they have, what data we have access to say, let's look at this together, and for us to be more informed as to how we tailor our support for our different librarians and for our schools as they work to support our students. I would also say that it's given us the opportunity to have data literacy conversations and do a lot of educating there as well, that when we've presented the data to them, that we're able to have thoughtful conversations about what it says and what it does not say as well, so that we can perhaps operate in a space of good information as opposed to misinterpretation or in some cases wishful thinking in terms of what we have shown and what it doesn't show. That's also helpful, just I think from a professional practice, almost from a professional learning standpoint, that it's given us an opportunity to have really good conversations about data literacy to help support how they look at data and look at it well.
So what's next for continuing your work?
One of the things I think we want to know is like, what is the benefit to checking out books from the library? Or really, what is the value of going to the school library?
What Elk is also alluding to in there in our next steps is looking at things that are making a difference for our kids. And he has done the yeoman's labor of dispelling things that not only Susan and I have peppered him with in terms of, does the age of the collection matter? Does the level of investment and funding matter? Does, and we've thrown a number of the size of the collection, the age of the collection, all sorts of different collection characteristics, among other things, at him, and trying to suss out what has an impact on student behaviors regarding their circulation. And all of the above are no impact. And so there's a lot of conversation. We run into this often in our spaces of, well, if I just had a collection that looked a certain way, or I was able to do something a certain way or have certain materials, then that would have a positive impact in such fashion. But we're also been able to sort of address some of those theories that are incredibly prevalent in our field. And instead, what we're looking at is what's the partnership with a teacher like, in that what we continue to sort of come back to in successful places that we were able to identify in last year's data, that we were able to identify that they had some strong teacher-librarian partnership scenarios. And so that's part of the research design for our intervention this year, is what does it look like? It's not just the librarian, it's not just the library piece, but that there's a cultural piece within the school, and there's a partnership opportunity with the librarian and classroom teachers that might be impactful on outcomes for students. And so looking at that, which I appreciate because it does an idea would not cost additional funds, and it doesn't change, different things that are out of our control per se, or are harder to remedy, that this is something that might be doable across schools with their myriad setups and situations.
So, yeah, thank you, Elk, Kendra, Susan. Thank you for, I suppose, one, coming and talking to us about the research that you've been conducting over this last year and a half, but also, all bookend, pun intended, this episode with another heavy-handed literary reference. I love the quote by James Baldwin: "You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read." So thank you for collecting and analyzing and sharing data so that, we can get more books in our kids' hands.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Of course. Scott, thank you for co-hosting with me today.
Yeah, I enjoyed it.
And listeners, thank you for tuning in. We hope that you learned not just about data around our libraries, but also how you might kind of conduct some of your own research.
For more details, check out the resources in the show notes. And thank you.
Take care.
Thanks to Spencer Ziegler from the Data Lit podcast and co-host of our crossover episode, and to our guests, Kendra Allen and Susan Bach from Library Media Services, and El Castrera, DRA's Director of Data Strategy and Analytics.
Also want to give a shout out and thank you to our talented producer, Daniel Bunce, and my co-host, Scott Holcomb. We also want to show our appreciation for Wake County student Sasha Wilson from Millbrook High School for providing our theme music for this season.
All right. So what do we have coming up in our next episode, Brittany?
Yes. So our next episode will be kicking off the first part of our final Rewind episode. So while our colleagues weren't able to officially record this episode due to some staff transitions, we will still be rewinding their original idea and introducing data visualization and data storytelling in our work. So look forward to hearing that next time.
Yes, looking forward to it.